يا مكان في قديم الزمان. Once upon a time. It's 4.5 billion years ago, and we're all in a place called heaven. We're watching and being there for God, who is making his first creation ever. And this creation is made with a substance called fire. And the name God gives it is Iblis. Iblis grows up to become one of the most beloved, devout worshippers of God, until one day, when God is making yet another creation, and this time using a more superior substance to fire, known as mud. And with that, he creates human, and his name is Adam. And with the creation of Adam, God invites all the angels in the heaven to come and bow before Adam. And it is at that moment that Iblis's heart gets filled with jealousy, and he vows to go down to earth and tempt all human beings to evil. And that is how Iblis becomes known as Shaitan, the devil. I'm sitting with my 7-year-old classmates in our first grade classroom, strapped in our little chairs, eyed glued to the teacher, gasping at the story. It's 1997, Tehran, Saudi Arabia, my hometown. I go back that day to school, utterly consumed by the story I had just learned. And arriving home, I have a few minutes to spare before my mom calls me down for lunch. And I think, very good timing to get down to business. And the business I'm about to get down to is, I'm using my logic. It's a very interesting 7-year-old logic that says, if the devil was once a good person, a good creature, and then he turned evil, there's probably a chance he could get back to being good again, right? And so when you're trying to get someone to do something they stopped doing, what do? You remind them of what they loved about it. Logical. So I think, what's the closest thing I have to what the devil loved? He loved God. And so I open my drawer, and in my sacred drawer, I pull the closest thing I have to God, which is the Quran. And I sit on my little bed, and with my little hands, I open the Quran, and I start to read out loud in hopes that he could hear me and remember how much he loved God. And I'm hoping, he'll turn to being good again. So 2 amazing things happen at that moment. The first is realizing how sound a 7-year-old logic can be. And the second thing is realizing the power of stories to unlock something within us. Maybe even, you can say, as radical as unlocking a superpower within us. And if stories had the power to unlock a superpower, could they also have the power to lock you up altogether? So I continued to grow in my education, and I was growing up in a relatively conservative education system, 5 religion classes a semester, many Arabic lessons, all of which were inundated with stories, which at the time I wasn't really aware of what these stories were sculpting and telling me about who I could become. By the time I hit the 4th grade, I had begun a journey of being the rebel child, asking a ton of questions, getting to a lot of trouble for asking those questions, mostly by the teachers who felt that I was challenging their knowledge. I remember my mom coming year after year from the teacher-student conference in tears because there's been complaints that Leena has been asking too many questions. And even though she was in tears, she would tell me, Leena, if they stop you from vocalizing your questions, you write them down on paper. You never stop being you. And I took that to heart, maybe a little too much. So by the time I was in high school, I was already very comfortable with this rebel child status. And I had begun to be known as the classroom lawyer and very good at the teacher-student debates. And so I remember this one moment where we were sitting in religion class, and let's call the teacher Miss Sara, and we're taking the lesson, and we're writing. I don't really remember what it was about. It wasn't so memorable. But I do remember this. There was one little girl kind of shivering, and she raised her hand very gently, and she said, Miss Sara, I want to share something with the class. This is mid's class interrupting. And she said, I've been afraid because the last few days I've been having doubt about God's existence, and I really don't know what to do about it. It's making me nervous. What does this mean? And so the teacher says, everyone, put your pen down. and she marches to the chalkboard where she draws a big circle. And she says, you have now left the faith of Islam. And you're on your way to being an infidel, so you need to repent immediately. And so, looking at the little girl who is now shivering, I raised my hand very innocently to get picked, but not so innocently is what I'm about to say. And it is that, you know, Miss Sara, we just learned a few days ago the story of Moses. Does anyone know the story of Moses? So the story of Moses, there's a scene, or part of the storyline is when Moses is actually experiencing doubt about God. And he's experiencing the doubt so much that he asks God to show him himself. So he says, Lord, let me see you. So I say, Ms. Sara, you've taught us this story. And if Moses is a prophet who is, you know, communicating with God and is having doubt about God, then shouldn't a young girl who is not on her way to prophecy, who is, you know, still in high school, probably naturally have doubt about God too? You can imagine the horror in her eyes. I was immediately asked to leave the room. And moments like this happen enough to the point where I started to build confidence in my rebellious logic. And I knew that something was missing, and I was adamant to continue to dig deeper and to listen to this voice inside of me. And so I started to apply to colleges abroad. I knew I wanted to go study abroad. I was the first in my family to study in the United States, and I wanted to go to a rigorous school, so I applied to all the most difficult schools you can apply to because I knew I'd get in. And I got rejected to almost all of them. And I saved all the rejection letters because I was like, I'm going to email those rejection letters back to them when I become successful one day. And there was one school that I did get into, and it was Bates College, obviously in Boston, Massachusetts. Not in Boston, Massachusetts. I found out when I landed to Boston that it's actually in Maine. And two amazing things happened when I was at Bates. The first is that I almost froze to death. And the second is that I told everyone that I was homesick because I missed my camel in Saudi Arabia that took me back and forth from school. Just kidding, those were not the two amazing things. So the two amazing things that happened were, first, that for the first time, I was acknowledged for the questions that I was asking. I remember my mom, now in new tears, receiving a letter from a professor saying, your daughter asks the most amazing questions. And the second is that I realized that my rebellious logic was it actually had a name, and it was social scientist. And this social scientist was very interested in understanding and studying stories. And so one day in the Bates Library, as I was strolling around, I happened to pick up a book, very magically, that was called How to Teach Math to Black Kids by Shahid Muhammad. And the theory behind the book was that this African-American teacher noticed that his African-American students weren't doing very well in math. And what he thought was, what if I introduced to them a powerful story about the African-American contribution to the math discipline? And he did. And he noticed that the minute he introduced this context where they were relevant, their scores skyrocketed. And it was a moment there where my rebellious logic clicked, and I thought, wait a minute, if the lack of a powerful story can cause a group of students or a group of citizens and human beings to really not see something empowering inside of them, then what is the current story that's being told to little girls and boys in Saudi Arabia? And you can say all over the world, but I was interested in Saudi Arabia. And so I went back to Saudi Arabia, and I filled up my suitcase with a lot of books, the public school curriculum books, and shipped them, took them back with me to the United States. And there I sat amongst the books and started reading book by book and investigating the current stories and what they were telling us about our potential. And what I found was extremely startling for both boys and girls, because the narrative that was scripted was extremely narrow. And even in cases where they were teaching stories were made to teach grammar, they were also teaching gender. And for both boys and girls, it was narrow, but I focused on girls. And for girls, the interesting thing was girls had two roles. They either could be pious worshipers and wives, or daughters, sisters, and if they were to have a job, maybe teachers, and that was about it. In a lot of the other stories that were about the workforce, girls were invisible. And so I had this moment where I was thinking of a picture I have of myself. You might know this picture when the teacher asks you, what do you want to be when you grow up? And you say, I want to be the firefighter. And mine was, I want to be a babysitter. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but when I was sitting amongst all these stories that we were being, inundated with day after day, it became clear that this was something that was paved for me. And I began to wonder, what would I have been without my rebellious logic, without the support of a mother who empowered it, and without having left and investigated this rebellious logic? And so, upon conducting this research, I'm an optimist. So I didn't want to just leave it down on this note, a sad note of, this is the case of the education system. I wanted to now see if stories could lock something in little girls. Could they unlock something? So I went to the best program I could find. It's the Mind-Brain Education program at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And I was adamant to go there to study the power of stories on the mind. And my research starting up was really showing me that when you scan the brain of a child reading a story, if it is if they can get transported with a story, then indeed the story has a power on them. And you can actually see it on their brain, and you can even see it in their behavior. But I was interested in now going to Saudi Arabia and studying those little girls and seeing how stories impacted them. And so I go back home. And the group I'm now picking to study is, of course, 4th graders, because that's the age that got me going with the rebellious logic. And I asked, before I design my research, I want to meet with the 4th grade girls, and I pick the discipline math, and I want to meet with the most struggling girls, so the ones who are borderline failing math. And so we sit in a little round table together. And I begin to kind of ask them questions. How do you feel about math? What is it? What do you think when you know that math class is coming up? And like 4th grade girls, they start to get a little bit more and more comfortable, until one little girl, let's call her Noor, she raises her hand and she says, I don't really like math. And I don't like math because I'm a very logical girl, and my dad taught me how to value my logic. And my logic tells me that why do I need to memorize the timetables when I can go to the supermarket and have my calculator right in front of me and do it all very quickly? And I'm looking at this little girl and I'm thinking, do you have a job? Because I'm hiring right now. And this girl I see this girl, Noor, and I see in front of her all these opportunities of being an engineer, being a scientist, being a leader, you name it, musician, dancer, anything she wants to be. And the thing that I think is missing between Noor and that path is a story. So I go home and I am looking for that story for Noor. And I start to call some influential women that I know in the kingdom, in the country. And they're telling me, let me think about it. Let me go through my books, which Saudi woman, which Arab woman, and it's a complete disaster because I can't believe that we cannot find a woman to share her story. And so after a few days of digging, I come across this incredible story that even to me, who consider myself the story researcher, is shocking. So it's the story of a little girl named Sukaina. Sukaina lives in the 8th century, which is the golden era and the golden age for Muslims. And it is the time period where Muslims are contributing to literature, to art, to philosophy, and they have huge libraries and they're translating everything. Incredible time period. And Sukaina grows up with a very supportive grandfather who loves her dearly, and she's a very soft-spoken little girl, so her grandpa gives her the nickname Zubayda. Zubayda in Arabic means little butterball. It's a very sweet name. So let's call her Little Butterball, because that's what I called her for the little girl. So Little Butterball grows up, and her grandpa invests in the best education for her, bringing her the best teachers in town to educate her every day. And she grows up to become this incredibly intellectual, very well-spoken woman in the community, a poet, a writer, a speaker. And at the same time period, there is a king. The king's name is Harun al-Rashid. Any Arab you ask about Harun al-Rashid will know him right off the bat, because he is a very prominent person in all our literature and our history books. The thing that Arabs might not know is that Harun al-Rashid was actually married to Little Butterball. And she was not only the queen, but she was an incredibly prominent queen. And in fact, her name was written on the local currency. So that's how prominent she was. And in some cases, in fact, people say she was more prominent than him. And so after his passing, after he died, she continued to be the queen, of course, and she was leading the kingdom and the Arab region. And she was I forgot to mention she's an incredible hiker as well, on top of being everything. So she's hiking from Baghdad to Mecca, which is about 900-mile hike. It takes 18 days if you do it 10 hours a day without breaks. And so she's hiking on foot. And this is something she does regularly, by the way. So she, on her way, she notices two big problems. The first is that the region is very, very hot. The weather is very windy. And the pilgrims who are traveling down and back up are actually really suffering from this weather. And there's no stops in between. The second thing she realizes is that there is no water transported. And what that means is if you run out of water on your way down, you're going to die from thirst, which was happening in big quantities. So little Butterball sees this problem, and she uses a little bit of math and a lot of rebellious logic and decides that she's going to solve it, despite all the engineers of the time telling her she couldn't do it. And so she builds this project, and it is the most complicated hydroengineering project in history. And you currently, actually, if you visit the kingdom, you can see the remnant of the project still there. But not many people will know who it belonged to or what the story was behind it. And so I find the story, and I know this is going to be the story that I'm going to tell Noor and her friends in class. So I go there, and like a good scientist, I give them a pre-test to see their baseline. I give them the story, and I give them a post-test to see how they would, how the story impacts them. And I run home, you know, their eyes with Butterball were just incredible to watch. And I'm running home to see, do the results match the excitement I saw in their eyes? And there is a 21% overall jump in the class from one story, and a 23% for the girls who are failing. And that is an incredible jump. And I'm looking at the results, and I'm thinking, with one story, if we can see this jump, what would we see with a plethora and an ecosystem of empowering stories about people? And it is very clear that the stories we see and the stories we tell ourselves about who we can become impact how we show up in the world. And so, tonight, I want to premiere a story for you that no one has heard yet. You'll be the first people to hear it. You'll be my guinea pigs, if that's okay. And this story is a special one. So I'll begin. كان يا مكان في قديم الزمان. Once upon a time, there was a little girl from Saudi Arabia named Zuzu. They nicknamed her Sassy Zuzu. Sassy Zuzu was always with a different hairdo every single day. She just loved putting up her hair in crazy ways. And she also had unbelievable questions, asking them all the time, right and left, without being stopped. She got in trouble all the time for them, but that didn't stop her. And there was one particular special thing about Sassy Zuzu, and that was that she had a superpower. Can anyone guess what that superpower is? Closer? Rebellious logic. So her superpower was this rebellious logic. And Sassy Zuzu, every time someone tried to stop her or tell her, no, you couldn't do this, she used this rebellious logic. And she knew that with her rebellious logic, she could be whoever she wanted to be, and no one could pave the path for her. And little Sassy Zuzu is me. And tonight, I am flying to Saudi Arabia, as Eduardo shared, and I am also going to read the story of little Sassy Zuzu to other little girls in Saudi Arabia. And I can't wait for them to be sitting in their little chairs, eyes glued on me, mouth dropped, gasping at the story. And I can't wait for them to go home, completely engulfed with the story of little Sassy Zuzu, and go a few minutes before lunch, lay down on their bed and dream of all the things that they can be. Thank you.